Welcome to the Wild Physio Podcast with your host, Andrew Wild. Today, I have Stephanie Brantz on, who is a freelance television sports presenter, reporter, producer, and commentator, and now sits on the board of directors of Football New South Wales. Stephanie started her career with the SBS sports team in 2000 and has never looked back. Steph has covered the Olympics, Commonwealth Games, soccer, including multiple World Cups, Australian and US Open tennis, cricket, including the 05-06 Ashes, rugby, basketball, hockey, and many more sports and events. She's also appeared on Fox Sports as the lead commentator of the W League football competition. Steph has presented on sport on Channel 9 for many years and has also freelanced for Fox Sports and ESPN before joining the ABC as the face of their sports coverage in 2020. She joined SEN as host of Trailblazers with Stephanie Brantz, a weekly long-form interview program. I could keep going as Steph's resume is rather large. A huge welcome to Stephanie Brantz.
Lovely to be with you, Andrew. How are you?
Very well. This is a little bit left field for the podcast, considering a lot of it's fitness, physio related, but I thought there'd be a lot of good stuff we could go through today. And the reason why I got you on, I actually met Steph at Ellie Brush, who's actually been on the podcast. It was her wedding and Steph was the MC, did a great job. And we met and I thought it'd be a great opportunity to talk women's sport and also your career.
Lovely. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. And yes, I did look through your other episodes and think, oh, well, I wish I'd actually got into that physio qualification I originally wanted to do.
Oh, right. So you actually wanted to do physio?
Yeah, didn't quite get the marks. And next up was human movement studies. And so I went completely the other way and did international business relations when I left school.
Oh, right. And then you actually, the first question I had was you had a business for many years that was, you're a naturopath and also a personal trainer. And you did that for roughly 10 years prior to actually jumping into the world of sport. Is that correct?
That is correct. I decided after doing business, I had a few flaws in that theory because I was not great at micro and macroeconomics and was completely abysmal at accounting, which formed quite a large part of a business degree. And then when I moved to Sydney, I actually had always been interested in sport and played a lot of sport. And the only reason I didn't pursue sport further was because my parents, probably quite rightly at the time, said you can't make a living out of it. And for women, certainly when I was coming through, that was absolutely the case. But I still enjoyed that element of my life and health and fitness and well-being, and eventually changed tack with my university degree. And then I did at the time it was an advanced diploma of naturopathy, and I did my personal training qualifications as well. And I eventually also became a lecturer in nutrition in the personal training world. So I did that for 10 years. I had a naturopathic clinic in Newtown in Sydney and really enjoyed that. It's probably the hardest I've ever worked in my life because, as you would know, when you run the business as well as work in it, you're not just the face, the voice and the front person, but when you're practicing as well, 10-hour days were the norm. A lot of our clientele was in remedial and sports massage, which can be quite wearing on your own body. And of course, I was at the stage of my life where I started having kids as well. So it was not unusual for my receptionist to have one of my babies on her knee while I was seeing clients. So it became quite a frantic part of life, but one that I really enjoyed. It's one that gives back to you as much as you put into it.
Yeah, for sure. And currently, considering your background with that, how do you normally work out per week? And is fitness still a big part of your life?
I knew you were going to start. Yeah, I'd love fitness to be more a part of my life. I still play a bit of social tennis. I go to the gym nowhere near as much as I should. And I go through phases, Andrew. When I was working at the Women's World Cup in France in 2019, my cameraman and my assistant producer were mad into their HIIT workouts. So they'd drag us all out every afternoon to a HIIT workout. I've never been so fit in my life, which offset all the croissants and red wine and cream and cheese and all those other wonderful things that we were eating while we were over there. And I really enjoyed that. And it's usually a time factor for me, but I really love feeling fit. When I was playing basketball, it would be, you're going to laugh, probably before you were born. It was about 20 years ago. I was playing a game of mixed basketball and I just had my third child, and when I went up for a rebound, my hips were knocked sideways by one of the more enthusiastic opposition, and I felt something click in my back, and I wasn't sure what it was, but I decided that I'd broken my back because the next morning I could barely walk. So I was log rolling out of bed and had all sorts of issues, went and had an x-ray, it showed nothing. And what eventually transpired was that by the time I couldn't move my big toe, my doctor said, you look like you're really crooked. Is something going on? And I said, I hurt my back. It's all right. I think it's just muscular. And she did a few tests on me and found out that I had nerve damage running down one leg, sent me to a neurologist. And within a week, I was having surgery for a herniated disc.
Oh,
And
wow.
that made me much more aware of my health and well-being and how to actually treat your body, how you sleep, how you lift, all those things that you hear about. And when you're young and fit, you don't think anything of it. And I got to the stage where I had to think about that. And that made me quite aware of taking care of my body. And it's something that I look at when I look at female athletes now, particularly in commentary. While I've never done knees, which is a common problem, particularly in football players, backs are just, they're so undercared for. And I'm guessing you'd know a lot more about this than I would, but that made me very, very interested in making sure that not just the general health and fitness, but your core strength. And of course, if I put weight on, the first thing I feel is my back. So that's a better barometer than my wardrobe.
Yeah. Did you send the bill to the woman that cleaned you up?
It was a guy, and no, I didn't.
Oh, right. Yeah. It's always the case in mixed netball or basketball or something like that. The guys get a little bit too enthusiastic and they forget that they are typically bigger than the women and they knock them over. And I'm the first one to admit I've done that in mixed netball.
Well, embarrassingly, Andrew, this was a basketball match, and I'm 6 foot tall, so I'm not small for a female. But this bloke was, I think he was about 5'6", and it was we weren't a physical matchup, but I was the bigger one.
Now, what was the thing that prompted you to get into the world of sport after obviously having a successful career in naturopathy and the PT world?
Well, one of those things that's really purely happenstance, while I had my clinic and I mentioned that I had young children, I used to kick a ball around out the back of our place. And one day I was out there and a guy 2 doors up who I knew to chat to, he sort of leant over the fence and went, "Oh, do you like sport?" And I said, "Yeah, no, I really like sport." He said, "Oh, do you play it?" And we sort of had this discussion. And he said, "Have you ever been interested in reporting on sport?" And I thought, "Oh, I've never even considered." And he said, "I'm a director at SBS and we're looking for a sports newsreader, a female sports newsreader." So that lovely reverse sexism where the position has to be female. It also helped that I don't have a Anglo-white background. My parents are Dutch Indonesian. So that fitted the bill for SBS. So I went in and did an audition because I thought, wow, that sounds like fun. I thought it'd just be a little adventure. And I did have experience in front of the camera because coming through school and university, I'd had a modeling career and I'd gone overseas to do a lot of work over there, particularly in Europe. So I had that experience in front of the camera and thought, oh, this sounds like a bit of fun. So I went and did my audition and I was appalling. He gave me a script and it had names in it like Haile Gebrselassie, the long distance runner, and those sorts of things where if you haven't seen them before, you look at it and think, I don't know how to say that. So I was atrocious. I didn't get the job, but they did offer me the opportunity to train with them for a year. And the next time that job came around, I got it. And that's how I ended up on, first of all, a show called On the Ball, which was with Les Murray and Johnny Warren and those gentlemen. And then later on, I moved on to news reading on The World Game, which ran for many, many years. That was a 5-hour show on a Sunday. And then they gave me the job as host, initially co-host with Les Murray of Toyota World Sport, which was their flagship sports program, Monday to Friday in the evening. And then after the 2006 World Cup, they offered me that role on my own. But by that time, Channel 9 had stepped in because they clearly thought the World Cup was the time to start watching SBS. And yeah, so that career started from there. But I would end up, after you get a little bit of, and I say notoriety, it was very, very low key. But when you become more in the public eye, I'd start getting some very, very odd clients coming in for massage at my clinic. And
Oh,
that's
really?
when I thought, Oh, yeah, there was some unusual situations when you walk in and you find someone lying on the table, naked, face up, and they're clearly expecting a different sort of massage.
Oh my God, really?
Yeah, and I thought, oh, it's time to tap out.
Oh, so when did you finish up with the clinic?
Oh, that night. No, I'm joking. I finished, it was pretty much just as the World Cup was starting to go to air, because that 2006 World Cup was the first time that the Socceroos had qualified in 32 years. It was a big deal. I was hosting the highlights program and then doing news stuff through the coverage. And our coverage started about 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening and would run all night because, of course, it was in Germany. So it became incompatible with doing 10 hours a day in the clinic as well. And to be honest, it was, to be quite frank, it was less physical work and much better paid.
Yeah. Yeah.
No,
For
3
sure.
kids I took through school.
Very true. Now, actually, the 2006 World Cup, that would have been a massive highlight for you, no doubt, because Australia went berserk. I remember being in the boarding house at Riverview at the time and getting up in the middle of the night to watch the football. And even just growing up in that period, I remember seeing you on TV, and it was great to see a woman in a role in sport because it was quite unusual at the time. And this is segueing into my next question. How was it early on in your career? Because you were one of few, weren't you?
Yeah, there weren't too many others. I mean, Liz Deep-Jones had preceded me at SBS, as had Mika Buchan. And there were a couple of others. I remember Joe Griggs was still doing sport then at Channel 7. So there are a couple around, but what I found the most difficult thing was, and I don't actually think in some cases it's changed that much, but what would occur is someone would come in, say I think it was the Telegraph or the Herald came to SBS and said, oh, we want to do a story on the World Cup. And they put me on the front page of their paper, playing football with my kids, saying, soccer mum is the new face of the World Cup, which was completely untrue because I was one of the hosts, but I was doing the highlight show. The people doing the actual coverage were in Germany. And if I was one of the guys, say Andrew Osati was hosting the coverage back in Australia, and if I was him, I would have been filthy. They were fine, that they never mentioned it, but I remember thinking, oh, that's not quite how it is. But they had to promote, having a woman in the coverage, and that didn't change when I got to Channel 9. It was an absolute debacle because they said, oh, we'll put you on the cricket coverage, which became a big story about there's a woman back in the commentary box for the Channel 9 cricket coverage. Also untrue. I was never going to commentate. I was going to boundary ride, and that eventually became reporting. But it was just a huge story because it was a female. I think it's been normalized a lot more now, but at the time it was quite challenging. I never thought about being the only female. I went to a co-ed school, played a lot of sport. All our sport tour. While I was at school, I was a netballer, so the netball team would travel with the basketball team, which was mainly blokes. And it was just like having a lot of brothers. So it never occurred to me that you would be treated differently or was anything particularly special. I found that quite odd that such a big deal was made of it at the time. And while I think it's better now, I think we'll have actually achieved some parity when we stop talking about the women in the coverage.
Yes. Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, for sure. But you were definitely one of the trailblazers. And I even think back to that time. And I remember Kelly Underwood started to commentate in the Aussie Rules. And that was a huge moment in Aussie Rules coverage as well. And I agree. I think people focus on it a lot. It should be, if there's two people, male and female, they both apply for the same job. It should just be a matter of who's the better fit. Doesn't necessarily mean it has to be, we've got a woman commentator now. I completely agree.
Yeah, I think you're right to a certain extent. The only thing that I would say around that is that the opportunities for men have been greater. I don't know whether it's because guys are less hesitant to put themselves, but you've got to have a pathway for women to come through, because I've been commentating the W League for quite a few years now, and I can't believe there's not another female lead commentator in television. It's, where are they? It's not that women don't want to do it. It's, are we offering them enough opportunities?
And it's still an issue now just as it was 20 years ago. It's obviously not as big a issue, but what have you seen in the last 20 years in regards to that? Have people been a little bit more willing to employ women in the sport world? Because as I said, going back 20 years ago, it was just so unusual, which it shouldn't have been.
Yeah, I really think they have. And I think that the leading the way there has been Fox Sports or Fox Sports News initially. And I came very, very close to going there from SBS. I had a verbal agreement which had to really be unpicked or unraveled when I signed with Channel 9. But Fox Sports News brought quite a few women through. And even now, when you turn on the TV today, there's possibly even more women doing that than there are men. And then it became normalized to bring women into coverage. I don't like it when it's forced. And I don't actually, as a sports fan, I don't watch something because there's a male or a female hosting it.
Yeah.
If I don't like the country, I can mute it. If I don't like the host, I don't need to watch. That's not gender specific. I think now it's become less of a talking point. And I think cricket probably led the way in that when they brought the likes of the Lisa Sthalekers, the Mel Joneses, and
Ishigua.
Yeah, Alison Mitchell, who are all excellent broadcasters, but they have a playing history. And so there is no reason that they can't be on that platform, because talking about cricket is talking about cricket, whether there's blokes or women out in the middle. You're talking about the sport. And if you're qualified to do that, then there's no reason that you shouldn't be able to sit alongside your male peers. And I think that's been probably the game changer certainly for cricket. The other sports have been a little bit slower. You mentioned Kelly Underwood, and I remember when she called a game, you probably remember better than I would, but there was this big backlash about, we don't like listening to a woman, and there shouldn't be a woman calling the footy and all that sort of thing. And to be honest, AFL's not my sport. So I could listen to Kel and I wouldn't know whether she'd done a good or a bad job, because I didn't know the intricacies of AFL. It's the one sport that I've never been intimately involved in. However, what she was saying didn't sound wrong. The difference with women is there's a certain timbre or a pitch to our voices, and you can hear it when someone calls a game or a goal. Our voices tend to go up, and I don't want to use the word shrill, but I'm always aware when I'm calling a goal that when your voice goes higher, it's harder on the ears. So men tend to have that lower pitch, which is easier to listen to. And also it's what we're used to. It's not that it's wrong or bad. It's just you're used to hearing sport delivered a certain way. And I think that's where it becomes challenging for people to accept the change.
Yeah, people don't like change. And in regards to the voice, because you do have an amazing voice and it's synonymous with football, especially women's football, in terms of...
I've got a very deep voice for a girl, and I know with the wonderful world that social media is, I've been accused of being a bloke, so...
In terms of that voice though, have you had voice training at all? Or is that just something you were born with and you've had to work on a little bit, or...
I had initially, when SBS was training me, they actually sent me to a voice coach. That was also as much to learn how to read auto cue, which sounds completely stupid, but the art of reading auto cue is to make it look like you're not reading. So there is actually a skill involved in it. And they sent me to a voice coach who actually taught me that when you're nervous, your voice always goes up. Not quite a couple of octaves, but it will lift in pitch. And so he had me doing all these exercises where you'd start with, he'd go, so, and then go, and then I'll start down there. And it's quite interesting. You can also hear that I can't sing. But he would make you lower your tone. And then it's quite amazing how you can lower your voice and then you can raise it and it become quite high. And he taught me probably a bit like singers would. Without the singing, but he taught me to lower that pitch and make sure that when I started, and it's not something I think about now, but back then he said, take a breath, lower your tone. It's always better to start a little bit lower. And so that was taught. And I think that there are voices, but there's men's voice I don't like either. So, I think it's a personal taste thing, but the lower and I guess not quite melodious, but those lower pitches are easier to listen to. So I think that's in your interest if you're going to sports broadcasting, just to remember that, get some voice coaching. It's, that's just part of the skills training.
Yeah, I've heard Mark Howard talk about the fact that they're now employing a lot more males that have more of a standard voice rather than that deeper baritone voice. He interviewed Dennis Committee on his podcast, and I was listening to that because Dennis had an amazing, quite deep voice. And even Dennis said back when he started in the 70s and 80s, most of the people in TV, radio that were male definitely had that deeper voice. But then Howie was saying that they're finally employing people like him that have just sort of a normal general male voice. Do you find that that's become more of the norm in, commentating, reporting as a woman as well, rather than going for someone like yourself that does have that, I suppose, a deeper voice?
I think so. I think a lot of the employment opportunities for women are you can't pretend. The days of having imposters are very much going out the door. So the first thing you need is complete knowledge of the sport that you're talking about, and you don't have to have played it, but you need to be a pretty good researcher and have the facts at your fingertips. You don't always need to be right, but you need to be unafraid of making a mistake and putting yourself out there. As far as the voice goes, I think if you were being interviewed, or if someone heard you, if they didn't like your voice, you wouldn't be getting an audition or a screen test or whatever. With the men, I agree. I think we're probably finding more of a happy medium. Girls don't have to be knockout gorgeous to get on telly anymore. However, boys seem to need to be prettier. So I think we're sort of seeing a leveling out where these standards are almost the same, because we talk a lot about how difficult it is for women to get into broadcasting. I would say if you're a 30 to 50-year-old white male, your challenges are just as high at the moment, because there's a propensity to want to have that diversity. So I think there's challenges for everyone, and in a diminishing, in some ways, landscape, because the way that we deliver sport now means that anyone can have a go. I mean, you're broadcasting right now.
Yeah.
And I don't think you tell me that you've got a communications degree and a background in broadcasting, but you can do it quite successfully. Very successfully, sorry.
Quite. I'd say quite.
So, yeah, I think it is tricky, but I think it also shows that there's an opportunity for everyone. And at the very base level, you just need to know your stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of people out there listening would be physios and other healthcare professionals that have probably thought about delving into the world of sport at some point. And I know I did. Back in sort of 2014, 15, I wasn't necessarily sold on being a physio for the rest of my life. And I started to jump into writing some articles for The Raw, and had my own blog, and I was writing all these sport articles, and I was really loving it, but I just never took that leap. And I have no doubt there's a lot of physios out there that want to jump into this world. Is there any advice you would like to give any of the listeners in regards to getting into the sporting world as a reporter, commentator, presenter, whatever it is?
Well, that's exactly the way to do it, is what you mentioned. Apart from contacts are huge. So that can be the easiest path in. Say there's been a spate of, let's go back to knee injuries in the women's game. If that's something that you are particularly qualified to deal with, then if you knew someone in sports presenting or in news or things like that, you could say, look, if you ever need an expert, I'm happy to have a chat, or write an article and submit it. Unfortunately, a lot of the lead-in work is usually unpaid, and that's the catch. Because I'm sure you get paid a lot more as a physio than you did as a blogger. At least I hope you do. But that's usually the easiest way, because you need a little bit of experience. I mean, I'm sure you don't start opening your own physio practice without having done some work experience with someone, whether that was paid or unpaid or part of your course. Broadcasting, in my experience, is not that different. And I still have things that I do for, I wouldn't say I would do them for free anymore, but I've done a lot of events because I do a lot of emceeing and public speaking as well. Now that's come from the media background, but I did a lot of smaller events for free at the start because they were offering you the experience. And until you get that and until people see what you're doing and like it, you don't build a business off that. As far as the broadcasting goes, I often think that you've got as much chance of being a host of a sports show or a pundit in a sports show now if you played sport to a certain level. You don't seem to need any sort of media background, but some of them are very, very successful. And obviously football is my first sport. And if you look overseas, the likes of a Gary Lineker, who's made an enormously successful broadcasting career, whereas I look at some of the pundits and think they can't string a sentence together. So there's an element of luck and being in the right place at the right time, but certainly putting as many feelers out as you can, those networks, and putting yourself in the right place, and just making sure that if you have the expertise, then you know how to leverage that to get to where you want to be in that media sense.
Because you are quite unusual in the sporting world at the moment, especially in Australia. Most people that get a job as a commentator or a special commentator, say for instance, or the Aussie rules, they've played the game at the highest level. Even in cricket, most of the cricket commentators are all ex-players that played for Australia, or they've at least played like Sheffield Shield. What do you think you need to achieve as someone that hasn't played at the highest level to become the best commentator for that sport? Especially for you, it'd be soccer.
Yeah, and I would not put myself in the best commentator field by any means, thank you, but certainly still learning that trade, because of course calling women's football, you call 13, maybe 15 games a year, and then you've got that massive off season, and then you go around again. So it's quite difficult to get the regular exposure and practice that you need week to week. However, it's understanding the intricacies of the sport. Football was one sport that I only played socially. I played a lot of, as I mentioned, netball and basketball, and I had big involvement in cricket. But cricket, I believe, is probably the one sport which is exclusively the domain of former players. And I'm trying to think if I know of any cricket commentators who, certainly in the big tournaments, that haven't played cricket. And I don't think there's too many. I know that for many years, Channel 9's lead was Mark Nicholas, and they used to comment on the fact that he's the only one that hadn't been in a national team captain. I think was probably where they were headed at that point, but certainly playing for their country at that level. And cricket seems to just have a plethora of talent coming through that they've been able to employ. Whether people love them or hate them, they have a lot of a large pool to pick from. With the football sports, and there are quite a few down the years in AFL, league, union, and soccer or football, that you can be the expert, the lead commentator, if you're good enough at calling the action, and then you've got an expert who is the one that has to have played and have that experience. So I can look at something, and my job is to call the play. I call what I can see happening and identify players for the viewers, and let them know where we're at and what's happening and the context of the game. But when something happens and you get a replay, it's up to my expert co-commentator to unpick that and tell us why. And that's really the difference in the roles. So that there's no reason that you can't be a decent lead commentator without having played the game to that elite level, but you've got to have a pretty good understanding of it. And I've spent all of my media years immersed in the football world. So I didn't work in football, but I worked in football media.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the best Aussie rules commentators of all time, Dennis Committee, never played at the highest level. He played waffle, and
Yep.
he knew the game very, very well. And he was on the verge of making it into the VFL, but he was the greatest commentator, I think, in that world. And Bruce McAvaney is another good example. He never went to the elite level, the Olympics, or he never played Aussie rules at the highest level, but he was a great commentator. He's hung up the boots in terms of the Aussie rules, but I'm pretty sure is he doing the Olympics, or who has the Olympics this year?
7, and I believe that Bruce will be doing it. Bruce extraordinary though, isn't he? Because he can call anything. I think he could call 2 flies crawling up a wall and everyone would listen, because he's just got that art of creating a moment.
Oh yeah, There's so many of those amazing sporting moments, especially when I was growing up through the 96 Atlanta Olympics and then 2000. You just think about Bruce and some of those amazing moments, you know, Kathy winning the gold in the 400 in the 2000 Olympics, you know, just some of the quotes that he's come up with over the years are phenomenal. I even actually did I think it was 2016, I did an article on my blog and also for the Raw about Dennis Committee retiring, and just some of the amazing quotes that he's had in the game of Aussie rules. Some of them you might not know because you don't know the game as well. But he was just an absolute genius, and he had that quick wit, which you probably need. Is that something that you work on as well? Like having some humor up your sleeve and something else here and there in the game of, especially like a game like soccer, because often there is some downtime and also there's a lot of games that there's not much scoring.
And I've got to say that I've called some other sports. I called a Fiji Legends and Classic Wallabies union match a few months ago. And I quite enjoyed the change in pace because there's a structure to the way that game goes. It moves up the field and then it moves back down the field. And you can always see who's got the ball. They're normally in relatively the same spots. And it just made it much easier. And when they cross for a try, you don't have to call it that second. You can create a story around it and he's over or she's over or whatever. With football, I find the most nerve-wracking thing is the fact that on the highlights or on the newsreel or the news story later, which talks about the match, there's only going to be one line on that or one line per goal. And if you stuff that up, you know that's when the newsreader keeps talking and saying, oh, Sydney FC scored 7. Here was their third, blah, 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 tapped in by Ellie Brush, yada, yada, yada. And you know that they're talking over it because the call of the goal wasn't what they were after. So there's firstly the art of getting the line right, which you can prepare, but it might not unfold the way you're hoping. And I remember preparing for the semi-final up in Brisbane just recently. And who could have foreseen that being a 6-2 finish? That's not how it was meant to be. And that's not how I had it pictured in my head. And you've got to be careful not to take that into a match with you. So the line for the goal is most important because that's the one that gets replayed. The chat around build-up, because things can change so quickly. I always find that you occasionally get pulled up at least once a season where you're caught off guard and someone fires off a shot from halfway and you think, wow, I did not see that coming. So you've got to stay on top of that. And then that downtime bit, because particularly in women's football, which is a little bit slower sometimes than the men's game, there's a lot of time for chat, and you've got to be careful that you don't weave off course and you keep it entertaining. And I think a lot for the women's game is still about storytelling as well, because some of the players are not that familiar, but when you've got 15, 16-year-olds playing and they're killing it in the league, that deserves a conversation as well. So there's a lot to talk about and a lot to unpack within 90 minutes, but to keep it entertaining is the key. As for the wit and the repartee, the better relationship with you have with your co-commentator, the easier that is. I was once told that you should do commentary as though you're sitting in someone's lounge room with them. Yeah. And that's how they should feel. And that can sometimes be quite difficult because you get completely caught up in I'm here at the game, and you start treating the occasion like that. And that's why perhaps I think sometimes men and younger guys are better natural commentators, because they do sit around in a pub and endlessly talk about sport. And I'm not saying that we women don't do that, but it doesn't seem to dominate our conversation as much. Although, to be fair, I've sat around with some of my friends and talk sport all afternoon. So it's it's an individual thing. But that's the goal you're trying to achieve. Make it easy for people to listen, make them feel like they're part of the conversation, and make them feel like they're at the ground.
Yeah, and it's definitely one of the reasons why people loved listening to Bill Laurie and Tony Greig, because it was much like two guys sitting in a pub watching some cricket over a beer and kind of just paying each other out here and there. And it was just such a good energy to it. And I just loved listening to those Channel 9 commentators growing up, and I kind of miss them, like Richie. And it was just such a great dynamic. And I don't think they've nailed it in terms of the current crop at all. And it's hard to get to that level. And it's much like Dennis, like even the Aussie rules this year, because Bruce retired, now there's no Bruce, there's no Dennis, they're struggling. And I really don't think that they've got that great a balance at the moment.
And it's a different market too. We're watching, we want instant gratification with our sport, and we're a lot more savvy in what we're listening to. And we're also much quicker to judge, and we have social media, so you can tell everyone about it as well.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, I've heard Bruce and Dennis talk about this before, and Richie actually, how much time they spend outside of the game researching players, researching the game, looking further and doing as much work as possible so they're ready for that game or that season. How much work does it actually require? Because there's a lot of players to know, there's a lot of stats to know, and it's also, you just got to get prepared mentally for that game, and it's week to week to week. How do you do it?
I would spend probably 5 or 6 hours researching each game. It depends. Later in the season, it gets easier because you've seen them all before. But the first couple of weeks of a season, the preseason, you spend many hours researching the individual players. And for the W League, which is predominantly what I would call, you need to usually either ring the player, ring the press person, ring your mates that know them who are coaching, and get some information, because it's not on Google. And that makes it really hard for the women's game, because also when they come on the pitch, you need to have those facts at your fingertips. I remember when Ellie Carpenter started, it was, it wasn't who's this girl. You kind of need to know who she is, because she's clearly a very talented youngster that's going to go places. So you need to be able to latch onto that information in your brain immediately. And that does take research. You've got to assume that as far as how the match unfolds, you already know that. Not how it's going to unfold, but the mechanics of calling a football match. But it's the content that you put into it that is the trickier part. And that research is, you always have too many notes, and it's much better to have too much information than not enough. Also, when I do work with Fox Sports, they've got incredible stats people who can get in your ear and say, oh, that's their 14th goal for whoever or in the season, or that's the third time that this team has scored against that team. And, they've got other wonderful facts. So it's not that we're not helped out. And I know that the Channel 9 cricket stats are brilliant. Like that, I've had the privilege of sitting in that commentary box up the back watching them work, and it's quite extraordinary. But the more you work in a sport, the more you just know it. It's like you with your clients. When you first meet them, you need to do the big sort of what do you call
it? Subjective
yeah.
assessment, yeah.
I know everything about them, but when they come back in, you know that they broke their left leg when they were 6 years old and it's never quite healed, and you don't need to relearn any of that. So it's a similar situation in commentary, but Richie really was the doyen. And when I came into that team, it was Richie Benno, Bill Laurie, Tony Gregg, Ian Chappell, Mark Taylor, Michael Slater, and Mark Nicholas. It was the dream team of commentary, which perhaps, a lot of people said needed refreshing and renewing, but they were the voices of my childhood. And they were extraordinary people and very generous with their knowledge. I used to love sitting at the bar and listening to Chappelli argue with some of the others over the players they liked, the players they didn't, who was coming through, what they were watching in India, what they were seeing in England. And it was first because they were immersed in that life. And I remember, I don't know if you recall a wicketkeeper called Geraint Jones.
Yep.
He was playing in the Ashes series I worked on. And I went to Richie and said, Richie, can you tell me, is he Geraint or Geraint? And he said, I think he's Geraint, but I'll come back to you. In 45 minutes later, he came and tapped me on the shoulder. He'd written out a list of facts on what saint he was named after. It was just extraordinary. And he'd actually done all of that just for some idiot reporter that had asked him for a name pronunciation. He was the master. He was brilliant. And just so it's been well documented, he was the master of saying a lot by saying nothing.
Yeah, Michael Slater said that when he asked Richie for some advice when he started in commentary, and Richie said, understand the value of silence.
Yep.
Which is...
Unfortunately, some people take silence too far and they actually add nothing.
Yeah.
However, he knew when to use the silence and when to let the pictures tell the words. And I think we fall victim to that because also when you get nervous and you're calling a sport, you tend to want to overtalk. And you forget, particularly on television. On radio, it's a little bit different, but on television, people can see what you're looking at. They're there with you. You don't have to describe that it's really exciting, because either it is or it isn't.
Yeah, for sure.
So,
And there is a big difference between radio and TV, and even how Jim Maxwell commentates cricket on radio versus how they commentate on TV. You know, I actually often turn the TV down and listen to Jim.
yep. Yeah, no, I love Jim, another excellent broadcaster. And I've worked a lot on events with Kerry O'Keefe too. And he's just enormously entertaining, with the ability to be able to go off randomly talking about what they're getting for morning tea and then bring it straight back to the delivery at that moment. And I just think there's enormous skill in a lot of those broadcasters. There are guys coming through and lots of really promising women coming through, but they'll always be the favorites for me. That's the sounds that, leather on willow during the summer.
Yeah.
And you're in another room, but you can always hear the cricket.
A lot of people see the end product on the actual game and they think that there's not that much work behind the scenes. But someone like Kerry, he often talks about it when he's commentating, how much time he spends watching cricket and researching cricket. And he always mentions his wife, how he's off just watching cricket. He's like, oh, sorry, Hashim Amla is batting in South Africa at the moment in midnight. I'm getting up out of bed to go watch the cricket. They do so much work outside of the actual time that they're there commentating. And the other thing with Kerry, he's a good example of someone that's, a lot of people think that he's just there for the humor, but he's actually one of the voices of reason in regards to cricket, I think, in this country, let alone the world. And he's got that perfect balance of being a bit of a larrikin, and he's hilarious, but he's also phenomenal at what he does. And he's one of the better commentators out there.
Agreed. He was my favorite Stumps guests when we did that. So we do it after the New Year's test every night for the members. We do a stump session, and Kerry, I think I had him for about 5 or 6 years in a row, and he was just brilliant. It was so easy. He'd wander in, you could ask him anything, he could talk to anything, he'd throw in a joke, but he'd give you the proper serious and considered response as well. He's extraordinary.
Yeah, he's phenomenal. I love Kerry. The frog in a bank joke will go down in history as one of the greats.
Will it though?
It will. It's so good. Now, Steph, I know you've got probably another 5 minutes. I'll get on to the last question. Let's do this. How do we get women's sport to the point where they are paid like they should be paid? An example of this is Ellie Brush. She has code hopped from obviously W League, and she's gone and played for GWS Giants in Aussie rules, but she still needs to work full time as a physio. It is a problem and it frustrates me, and I know it annoys her, and I have no doubt it annoys you. What do we need to do to get this to the point where women are getting paid what they should be getting paid for doing what they do in their chosen sport?
When you and I find the answer to that, we can both retire, because we'll have actually solved one of the world's great mysteries. What we need is proper broadcast deals for the women. I think if you can see it, and it becomes normalized to see women's sport on television. And we have seen that through the last couple of years, how all the deals have improved and the sports are becoming more professional. So we need to have a hell of a lot more of it in front of us, because that improves visibility. And then when you've got visibility, you can get sponsorship, and then you can get the money required. You've seen what's happened with certainly the cricket team, the women's cricket team. Their success, and success does help, their success and their visibility when they got better television coverage led to a stronger position for the CBA agreement with Cricket Australia, and they were paid better. Still not as much as the guys, but certainly they could live on their salary, at least at the elite level. For the Matildas, the women's football team, they managed to negotiate an equitable pay deal to the Socceroos. There's a bit of fine print there, because it is based on the games they play, and they play significantly or substantially fewer games than the guys do, but at least they got some level of parity. It's at that really top end, like the Premier League for the men's football or the IPL for the cricket. That's when you want to see that the levelers come in, and it can be done. You need people to advocate for it, though, Andrew. Saw what Serena Williams did. She fought very, very, very hard for the female tennis players to get the same money, and eventually it paid off. And I think people might underestimate how seismic that was for women's tennis. For women's golf, that's another one where the purses aren't quite as large, but there's a tournament in Victoria, the Vic Open, where they have equal purse for the men and the women, and they play at the same time. And I think that's also something very valuable. Interesting, we're talking about tennis and golf, which is the two tournaments where you can see men and women playing side by side. And that's, I think, a key as well. As far as where the dollars come from, yeah, I think sport in general is struggling, particularly in this country. It's been a really hard year to 18 months for financial injection, and the money is there. It's tapping into the right markets and hitting the right demographics and keeping our women front and center. They're a really good bet as far as sponsorship and media coverage goes. You're not usually going to get stories about them, up to no good on trips or urinating in car parks in public or all those sorts of things. So they're a fantastic bet from a sponsorship perspective. But from the business side, you've got to remember that you need a good return on investment. So they need visibility to be able to attract those dollars. So that was a very long way of saying I don't have the answer.
Yeah. You're right. You're 100% right, though. It's the visibility thing. And I had Bronte Campbell on my other podcast, the Hybrid Therapist podcast, and she said that about swimming, the fact that now it's not front and center. Back at the, around the 2000 Olympics, we saw swimming all the time. It was on primetime TV. And now you never see swimming. And most people wouldn't be able to tell you some of the big name swimmers that we're going to have going to the Olympics. So I completely agree. It needs to be more visible. And even, I've got the paper next to me here. You open the paper up and there's just not enough women's sport there. And it's really frustrating because we've got so many. Yeah, exactly. There's probably like a tiny section of the paper that is on women's sport, and there needs to be more coverage.
Exactly. And that needs someone at the top to make that change and give space to that. I work for ESPN, and they're very, very pro women's sport and women's coverage, but they also have an ESPNW, which primarily in the States, we sort of trialed it here. It still sort of hovers around, but having the separate website, I had a discussion with a colleague on the weekend about, I don't think giving women's sport a separate space is necessarily the answer, because then the people you've got going to those sites, those channels, those apps are people who are already engaged. Like, to get them, you need them on mainstream, on those sites, on those programs. And we're getting better. There's a long way to go, but we're coming off an extremely low base. So it is all about visibility and normalizing what you're seeing.
Exactly. Much like what they did over in the States with Title IX in terms of the college system, we need to bring something like that in, where there's an equal amount of money for women and men for, a certain sport, or even in the paper, there should be equal amounts of coverage, women and men. And then finally, we're getting more of these women front and center for people. And then it's going to be, more and more sexy and cool for these girls that are growing up to think, I want to be an athlete. I want to play Aussie rules. I want to play soccer. I want to play cricket. I think it's getting there slowly, but it's taking its time.
What is happening now, Andrew, is that young girls are watching that and thinking, I can.
Yes.
It's actually a possibility now. And right at the start in your first question, what I said to you was I didn't pursue playing sport because I was told to go to university because I would never make a living out of it. And very few from my generation made a living out of their actual sport. They might be making it now in media, but it wasn't from actually playing the sport. Now I'd like to think that my daughter can watch sport on TV and think it's a possibility. Skill level aside, there's an opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of male sport, or male dominated sports like league and Aussie rules back in the 90s finally became professional. And it seems like the women's games are probably 30 years behind, which is ridiculous, but it took a while for the men's game to get to that point where it's fully professional. Because prior to that, they all had jobs and, they'd do their 9 to 5 and then go to training. It's much like that still in the women's games.
And it shouldn't be like that. You spoke about Ellie, one of her teammates, the captain of Sydney FC, Teresa Palas, as a school teacher. She couldn't go to one of the matches that they went to in Perth, I think it was, because she couldn't get leave from a job. You can't just pick up and leave. Hubbing the women, I believe, wasn't an option for the W League the way they did for the men, because you've got families, you've got children, you've got jobs that they don't get, 10 weeks off to go and do that. So as much as it's a sacrifice for all those men's teams that had to be hubbed and be away from their families, they actually had that option. And the women that they didn't. And we need to get to the point where women can actually support themselves playing sport, and that will see an increase in the professionalism, the skill levels, and then the exposure and the dollars.
Exactly. And there needs to be an injection somewhere, because a lot of people would argue it's a business at the end of the day, and they're not seeing the amount of people, watching it on TV in the women's AFL or something. But that's all well and good, but you need to still have the injections to get it to the point where it is more visible. So it's a real balance.
Maybe while physio, it's time for you to sponsor a women's team.
Oh, look, if I had the money, I'd do it. For sure.
Fair shout.
Thank you so much for your time, Steph. It's been an absolute pleasure. You've been very generous with your time, so appreciate it.
My pleasure. Anytime you want someone that knows nothing about how to fix joints in the body, give me a shout.
No, I think it's been really beneficial, because, as I said, I feel like there's so many physios and people in the health world that at some point have probably thought, I'd love to do what Steph does. I'd love to present, commentate in the sporting world. And I know I thought about it many times over the years. So I think it's been super beneficial. And there might be some people out there that this has changed their mind, and they're thinking now, physio is not for me. I don't want to work in this field. Maybe it's time that I give this a crack, and I'm going to go down the sporting route.
Fantastic. They'll all put me out of a job. Thanks for your help.
You can retire. You can retire, and they can, jump in and fill the void.
That sounds perfect. Andrew, thanks so much for having me on. It's been my absolute pleasure.
Thank you again, Steph. Where can everyone find you online? Have you got a website, that sort of thing? Instagram? Are you an Instagram type?
No, and no. I'm a social media Luddite. I'm a stalker on Twitter, or a lurker. No Instagram. Through you. There you go.
Okay, perfect. If you need Steph's contact details, let me know.
Trailblazers with Stephanie Brantz, Tuesdays at 8 on SEN. There you go.
Beautiful. Any final words?
No, that's it. Had a great time.
Yeah, me too. Me too. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and it's also on YouTube. Sorry, Steph, I didn't even tell you that this was going to go on YouTube, and you said that you hadn't put makeup on and everything, but you still look great, so it's all good.
Yeah, thanks. You can say that now that it's recorded.
Yeah, I threw you under the bus there. Apologies for that.
All good.
As usual, guys, stay strong.